check out ESPN Film's newly released 30 for 30 podcasts. From the producers of our award-winning documentary series, this is an amazing collection of sports stories you need to hear to believe. Speaking of amazing, Delta Airlines and the Fly Delta app make your travel experience amazingly easy with real-time bag tracking, e-boarding, and passport scanning during check-in. And don't forget to download 30 for 30 podcasts to fill your flight with stories that will keep you coming back for more.
This is the best. Do you hear me? Of the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Tom Luganville has been sitting here with us on television. Now you can hear him on radio. Tom, let's talk about quarterbacks. As you mentioned them briefly, everyone thinks the SEC may not be great overall, but from a quarterback standpoint, it has definitely improved. How would you, looking at the quarterbacks, how do you file them down in terms of ranking them?
Well, my top two right now would be Nick Fitzgerald at Mississippi State, then Jake Bentley at South Carolina. I think those two are have an opportunity to really take the next step. I think Jake Bentley, seeing the field last year, took a 4-8 roster and got them bowl eligible as a true freshman. We all know what's taken place with Ole Miss in that program, but Ole Miss still has some pretty darn good offensive players, and Shea Patterson's one of them. I think there's a great improvement there. I'm still waiting to see the development of Jalen Hurts in the downfield passing game. I know it was a point of emphasis in spring football, but it's also been a point of emphasis for everybody on their upcoming schedule for this entire offseason is to study Jalen Hurts and force him into an uncomfortable area of his game. So how much has he improved? Because if he becomes the complete player, now I think he's in the discussion of the top 2 to 3 to 4 quarterbacks in the entire conference. But until that happens, he's going to be looked at more as an athlete and an improviser and a runner and a guy that's sufficient in the passing game, and that's got to be better than sufficient for Alabama to get to where they want to be on offense.
You've mentioned a couple of quarterbacks, and I'm sure Auburn fans are calling in and saying, well, what about Jarrett Stidham?
So I take a very, 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 very large grain of salt when I discuss Auburn's quarterbacks, because I think we've all been burned before. We've had high expectations for guys. Don't look any further than the Jeremy Johnson situation a few years ago. And listen, I'm somebody that has intimate knowledge of Jarrett Stidham. I invited him to the Under Armour game, spent a lot of time with him. I have a tremendous amount of respect for him, but I still think he has to earn the job. If he earns the job outright throughout training camp, then are they going to be infinitely better offensively? Yeah, I think they are, because I think the kid is a really, really talented young man. But I also know that Sean White's not just going to hand over the reins. Right. And if you're going to really be fair about the quarterback situation at Auburn, and you look at last year, they had a run of about 5 to 6 weeks, Auburn did, where they were one of the hottest teams in college football on offense. And it was because of Sean White. It was because of Cam Petway. It was because of some of those young wideouts starting to emerge. So everybody around the quarterback position is going to be much better. Do I expect Jarrett Stidham to be the starting quarterback at Auburn? Absolutely. Do I think it's going to be handed to him, or that he's just going to run away and that the gap is so wide? I don't see that being the case, and I think a lot of people do.
There are a couple of places where they're actually competition. There's not many. Tennessee being one. Obviously, A&M, Florida, we're not sure. What are your thoughts on those just to start with?
I think Quentin Dormady will end up being the quarterback at Tennessee. I just think he has a little bit more nuance to the position. When I say that, Jarrett Guarantano is an extremely gifted player. He's also a one-speed fastball thrower, and part of his game is developing how to change things up a little bit, how to suit the throw to the route and lay the ball in there, some of those little things. You know, he may have developed that over the last 18 months. But I think Quentin Dormady's a little ahead of the curve there, so I think he will take the leap for Tennessee offensively. Listen, there's quarterbacks top to bottom in this conference that are unknowns, including the quarterbacks at Florida, and I use Malik Zaire in that same conversation because to assume Malik Zaire is just going to come in and be the starting quarterback at Florida, I think is naive. I think it is completely false in relationship to what he brings talent-wise and what they ask of you in that offense. Do I think he'll play? Yes. Do I think they will use him as a runner to force defenses to have to prepare for an awful lot? I absolutely believe that will be the case. But I think Felipe Frank will likely be the quarterback going into the season for Florida. And if Florida emerges with a quarterback, Paul, I'm telling you right now, that is a college football playoff roster top to bottom. Their roster, all the components that you look for, if a quarterback emerges, look out.
You talk about a lot of schools. We haven't mentioned Alabama. There isn't much dissent on Alabama. Some aren't convinced. You alluded to Hurts. What would concern you if I said you have to make the argument Alabama doesn't return to the college football playoff? Where would you lock your arms around?
Probably some faces and some names that the general public may not be overly familiar with, not materializing in the defensive front four. When you have some of the losses that they've had, you have some of the losses at linebacker. I just think that a guy like Raekwon Davis, all right, so we might be sitting here 10 weeks from now and talking about Raekwon Davis being the dominant player in the defensive front at Alabama. We also could be sitting here and finding a guy not emerge the way that they thought that he would. This is the first time, I think, that defensively, particularly within the front seven framework of Alabama, they might not be as plug-and-play as they've been in years past. I really think they're going to be exceptional offensively with their weapons and the maturity and some of the additions and the ability to reshuffle the offensive line. But there's going to have to be some guys step up and probably exceed an early expectation within their front. That would be my one concern if I had one with Alabama.
LSU has been projected very high. They certainly are not high on anyone's list for having a great quarterback. Is he good enough?
I think he's serviceable. My question is, if this hire of Matt Canada was made a year ago and you had the wideouts that played for LSU a year ago there, now we're having a different conversation. I don't know if this is so much about Danny Etling as it is about his trust in finding other options aside from DJ Chark. I think Drake Davis is an emerging star for them at receiver. People may not be familiar with him. I think he's going to be given every opportunity to be a go-to guy. But this offense is going to have a new look. You're going to see a lot of zone run game. You're going to see a lot of cutback stuff. You're going to see jet sweep. You're going to see end arounds, a lot of formations. I think their running back is not good. I think he's special. And defensively, keep this name in mind. Everybody's talking about the loss of Jamal Adams. They're going to have a safety in Grant Delpit that will be having, in my opinion, barring injury, the exact same type of draft status 3 years from now at safety. I don't see a huge drop-off for them on defense.
Tom, let me flip around the rest of the country briefly. The ACC has won 2 of the last 4 championships. They're projected with Florida State.
Sure.
Are you in on Florida State, or is Clemson or Miami emerging?
I still have concerns about Florida State and the offensive line. I think we all, if you've watched them or studied them, would acknowledge that. I really, truly believe people are discounting Clemson way too much. I think Clemson has earned the right and has proven that they aren't a flash in the pan. They aren't just you lose 2 or 3 of these guys, and now we're going to take a dip down. Each and every year over the last 3 years, everybody kept talking about how they lost these guys on defense, and every year they were better. I've seen them. I think they're going to be better on defense this year than they were a year ago. Too much emphasis is being placed on the loss of Ben Boulware. I think they've got arguably the best 2-deep front 4 of anybody in college football. And if they happen to hit on 3 quarterbacks in a row, all right, so if you had Taj Boyd, then Deshaun Watson, if they hit on a third one, outside of the loss of Mike Williams, offensively, everybody's back. And I think Tavion Feaster is a budding star in that offense. So I saw the coaches poll come out last week. If I'm looking at the roster top to bottom and I'm looking at where this team's at and the right I think that they've earned, I would have gone Alabama 1, Clemson 2 over Ohio State, over Florida State, all over all of them.
Wow. Plenty of free meals ahead of you down the highway. Beyond the ACC, and that's certainly a strong statement, Big Ten, Pac-12, Big 12, what do you think?
Big Ten, Wisconsin's schedule sets up for them to go 12-0 or 11-1 unless they just screw it up, because of who they don't play. It'd be very interesting, in my opinion, to see if Penn State is a sustained real deal, not just a team that was able to catapult that win versus Ohio State into something special. Let's hope it's for the better, because I think Penn State and college football is better when Penn State's good. Ohio State is probably the most ready-made team, in my opinion, for a college football playoff run, but I think they got real questions in the downfield passing game. Hopefully Kevin Wilson will be able to get that rectified. And, I would guard against the SC hype out of the Pac-12. I really would. I think the hype is completely grounded in one individual player, and that player is worthy of it. Is the rest of the roster capable? I still think Washington is the team to contend with. They've got a great schedule, and I think Stanford's the dark horse team. If Stanford's schedule was like Washington, I'd pick Stanford to win the Pac-12. And here's my other statement. We'll get on to the Big 12, Paul. If the Big 12 does not have a football team that is worth a darn on defense, I don't think they should be allowed into the college football playoff. Unless the other conferences screw it up, a one-loss Big 12 team should not be allowed in the college football playoff. The common denominator of a champion is a great defensive football team.
Yeah. Bob Bowlesby on line one.
That's fine. He can call me all he wants.
Tom Luganville, many thanks.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Jim Sturck is the athletic director at the University of Missouri. I think I'm right about this, about to celebrate his first anniversary on the job. Jim, thanks so much, and I'm sure you're wondering if it's been a year or maybe 5 times longer than that, but we thank you for being here. Congratulations.
Thanks, Paul. It's actually seems like a lot shorter. It's seems like a few months, but it's really flown by, and a lot of good momentum that we have going on, and I'm really excited about the upcoming year.
Jim, you inherited a very well-respected athletic director who happened to be caught up, like a lot of people on that campus, in some very difficult circumstances. You obviously embraced the job. You came in, but it hasn't been easy. I'm really interested in getting your thoughts on what this job, what the challenge of it has been like, and certainly so many other questions to follow up on from there.
Sure. One, I felt like it was a place that could have great success, has had great success, and we could, if I could stabilize and move forward, I think I thought a lot of good things could happen, and we actually had one of our best years overall athletically. We had 16 of our 20 programs made it to postseason play, and had a great fundraising year. So support there from a lot of different folks, and the first 6 months it was getting a feel for what had happened and where we needed to go. But I think we're hitting stride now, and I'm really, really excited about the upcoming year.
And certainly the second year for Coach Odom, we had the opportunity to meet again. We got to know him briefly, Conzo Martin, the new basketball coach, and really impressed with him. I know that was certainly you have many personnel decisions as an athletic director, but certainly that has been one of the most publicized. Talk about Conzo for a second, and the image and the perception of that program has changed literally overnight.
Yeah, it's the snowball is really getting bigger, and it really started with him and being able to secure him and his interest in coming back home, as he called it. He grew up in St. Louis and then moved across the river to East St. Louis, but he was a native Missourian, had worked at Missouri State and done a great job there, then moved on to Tennessee and Cal, and so he was someone that I identified early, that someone that could make a really positive impact. And then just what happened with the Porters and with Michael and Michael Sr., Michael Jr., the Robin Pinchton, our women's basketball coaches, their aunt, and she kept telling me that they wanted to come back to Missouri, and so if everything worked out right, that this thing could really, really take off. And I think we've gone from recruiting class of 250 to fifth in the country. So it's a really a fun thing to see the excitement grow about that. And then also Barry's second year, as you mentioned, and he's really doing a great job, and we're excited about the fall as well.
And certainly you alluded to fundraising, and we can act like it doesn't matter, but it does. It's not easy, especially today or in any time for that matter. But you've been around, and I'm sure there are a lot of answers for being successful here, hard work being one of them. But you've changed a lot of things, perceptions about the program. Take us through the last year, going out, meeting great Missouri fans all over, not only that state and Kansas, but around the country.
Well, I think you have an advantage when you're the flagship, and I had been at a land-grant institution before at Washington State University, so I knew that in every county of the state you have extension councils, and we've been able to engage with them and reach out to all the 114 counties in the state, and St. Louis and Kansas City, and so a lot of positive things to build upon. So and a lot of groundwork had been done. So for me, I think it was the right time, opportunity. We had a project that needed to get started and completed, and it would really help not only football but the rest of our programs as well, as freeing up space and where football currently is housed and works out. And so it was something that I think resonated with our alums and donors, and I think it's really been positive. We're going before the board later this month and getting final approval on the budget and moving forward.
It's interesting because a lot of us don't really understand what goes into that. Certainly a successful program helps, I'm sure, but when you're out with graduates, alums, boosters, what type of message do you convey, and what do you hear back from them?
So from my standpoint, I really try to focus that, our main goal is to create one of the best student-athlete experiences in the country, and that takes, an academic success, athletic success, and their personal development, and to have that success on all fronts needs support, and at the SEC we're fortunate enough to get enough support externally so that the university really we don't take away from any resources of the institution. And so that when they understand that, and they understand who we're competing against, the Alabamas and the Auburns and A&Ms of the world, they take pride in the university. They want the university to have success overall, and so you convey that message, tell them what you'd like to do, and hopefully that need matches their desire to support.
We're chatting with Jim Sturck, the athletic director at the University of Missouri. Certainly, basketball is huge out there. You mentioned the success in other sports. Football is also very important. And as we get ready for another football season, I'm curious your thoughts. Barry Odom certainly won a big game at the end of last year, which I think always helps fans become energized. Your thoughts on Barry and his program right now as he enters year two?
I think, Barry took it over and very successful, Gary Pinkel, but the program was a little bit down, and he brought us through a kind of a tough period, but I saw the makings of a great team and a great leader, the way he led the team, and they finished strong. They won 2 out of the 3 in the SEC to finish the season, and I think he's really been able to focus on getting back to football as opposed to trying to build the whole program and all of those parts around it. And so he's focusing on being a football coach and leading his team and leading his staff, and I think that'll really help. I think a second year of Josh Heupel and having an offense that was very successful last year, the second year, I think you can make a big jump with that, and having a veteran quarterback that runs that kind of offense. So I think those are a couple of the things, and obviously having 10 of 11 starters back on offense helps out a lot, and then Barry knowing what he wants to do defensively and the personnel, and I think these student athletes are focused. They've worked very hard, just like everyone across the country, but they're focusing on winning their division, and that's what the goal should be, and winning a title. So I'm excited about watching them compete, and there'll be bumps along the way, but I think they have great leadership within the program and with Barry and his staff, so I'm excited about that.
First game against Missouri State. We'll have it here on the SEC Network. Jim, I'm curious about your philosophy on scheduling. A lot of what you have, you inherited, but where does Missouri go next, or what is currently going on that at least you can discuss?
Yeah, so it's amazing. Football gets out there quite a ways, and we're scheduling games in 23 and 24, and I did inherit this one, But I think it's one where the SEC requires, at least one Power 5 opponent in the non-conference schedule, and I think that's appropriate. And with this league, you don't need much more than that as far as Power 5 opponents. But I think you're looking for a balance of teams that we do want to have 7 games. We at times in the past, and I want to do it in the future, of playing a game in St. Louis, playing one in Kansas City, and so we're looking to do that and trying to balance all of that.
And we didn't mention the basketball tournament heading to the state of Missouri. I'm sure that's a great sense of pride as well in Columbia.
Yeah, it will be. It'll be great to host it in St. Louis, and I know the Sports Commission is very excited, and the city's very excited, and with the renewed basketball interest, I think that'll really not only add to the bragging rights game that we have in St. Louis against Illinois, but then the tournament. We know that the fans of Kentucky and others attend in strong force, but I think that we'll have a great crowd there as well.
Jim, many thanks. Congratulations on a tremendous start from every aspect, including fundraising. We look forward to seeing you very, very soon.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
You bet. And I think we will.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
You're not worth a flail.
Daddy, where do babies come from?
Honey?
Mommy went to the store.
Oh, well, you see, there's a mommy and a daddy, right?
Right.
And see, when they call Geico, they could save a bunch of money on car insurance.
Oh, really? And that makes them happy?
Yes, that makes them very happy.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we could have this talk, Sunshine.
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
The most intriguing coaches in 2017, a story Pat Forty wrote. We're going to get to some other issues that we want to talk to Pat about, including his latest on the Ole Miss story. But we'll start on a happy note, Pat, because we're just a happy show. Thanks for your time. We were commenting during the break about no Nick Saban on your top 10. Is that because he's just such a standardized success story, or is there something else to it?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. He's certainly a known commodity. He's the best coach in college football. You could argue he's the best coach ever in college football. So, fair or not, that does take a little bit of the intrigue out of it. The way last season ended certainly was intriguing. I'm not sure there's a lot of carryover from that with the loss and the firing of Lane Kiffin and all the tumult that went into it. But still, I think Nick Saban's probably a little bit more of a predicted commodity than a lot of the other guys out there.
Pat, I'm really curious because you're not only a great writer and a reporter, but someone who is able to frame history, having seen so much of college sports. Had Saban won that game, had you been able to wipe the last drive off, would the conversation be really much different today?
I think so, yeah. And it's amazing, and that's how fickle it is and probably unfair in the grand scheme of things, but that's the way sports works, that if Clemson doesn't score that touchdown with 1 second remaining, if Mike Williams doesn't make a heroic catch on that drive, if a couple other things don't happen, Nick Saban has yet another national title, and I think we're making a very strong case he's the greatest coach ever. As it is, he's answering questions about whether firing his offensive coordinator in the middle of the playoffs was a fatal mistake. That's how football is. It can turn on a play here, a play there, and all of a sudden it can rewrite history, so to speak. But I think his place in the record books is quite secure. But it would have been even more outstanding if they had pulled off that game.
And I'm interested, John. During the break we were talking about Pat's list of the college football's 25 most intriguing coaches, and no one's suggesting it's going to happen, although a loss to Florida State would certainly bring on the conversation. But in watching the great ones over the years, Pat, whether it's football or basketball, we just saw a bolt on Saturday. For what reason, I don't know why he ran in the World Championships, but he could have ended last year with another gold medal, but he kept pushing it, and he ended up finishing third. I mean, trying to find the moment where these great ones stop. I'm really curious about what you have to say, especially in relation to Nick Saban, who is 66 years old.
Yeah, certainly it's an intriguing question, isn't it? When the peak happens and when the downslide starts, and I'm certainly not ready to say Nick Saban is on the downslide based on a touchdown with 1 second left last year against a really good team. But, we'll see how it plays out this year. They do start with just an incredible opener. I don't think losing that game unless one of the other teams gets blown out will be a kind of damning referendum on either team or either coach. It would be a losing streak for Nick Saban, which is certainly a rarity. It would be 2 losses in a row. But you can lose that game and still end up winning the national championship very easily. Either Florida State or Alabama could.
Pat Forty with us from Yahoo. Another story out today by Pat about the Ole Miss situation, Houston. Now, Pat, you've been all over that story from the beginning. Before we get to today's news, if we could go back a few weeks, if not longer, obviously, with Houston Nutt, what brought this on, and what was he looking for then that he may end up getting now?
Well, yeah. If you go back to the genesis of this, the point was to get a public apology for Houston Nutt from University of Mississippi for what his lawyer, Tom Mars, has portrayed as, basically a character assassination or defamation by saying that the NCAA investigation was primarily based on problems that occurred under Houston Nutt, and that turned out to not be the case. And so they have sought first an apology, and then with greater aggressiveness as it's gone along, they've sought more. They filed a lawsuit seeking punitive damages. Tom Mars's research ended up taking out Hugh Freeze from his job at Ole Miss. He has certainly been combing through other records in pursuing this lawsuit, and now is a little bit of a deviation, I guess you would say, because he's proposed this really kind of intriguing settlement, I think, of no money for Houston Nutt, but $500,000 to start a commission to promote integrity and honesty in Mississippi college athletics, which he's once again put Ole Miss into a corner here and basically said, are you for integrity and honesty or not? And now it's going to be up to Ole Miss to respond.
And we do have Ross Bjork on our program later in the week. Do you expect a response from them soon?
I don't know. It's been interesting. They've certainly, Ole Miss, I think Ole Miss's dismissiveness of this whole thing is what put them in a bind to a degree, but I'm not sure they feel like they're in a mood to settle this. I'm not sure they feel like they're in a mood to apologize at this point, despite the ancillary damage, I guess, that's been done there. But it will be very interesting, I think, Paul, just to see, does Ole Miss continue to dig in its heels, or does it say, this is a reasonable settlement that might call off this pit bull here and allow us to just get on with things?
Pat, I'm just throwing this up in the air, rhetorically perhaps, but can they afford to apologize? And by doing so, wouldn't they be admitting that they did what Houston Nutt has accused them of doing by communicating with journalists, although everyone knows that happened, and would that not be a violation of some confidentiality agreement that the school had?
Yeah, that it had with the NCAA, and that's where things get a little bit dicey here. There's phone records that show Hugh Freeze communicating with journalists in the aftermath of the release of or at least the story about the notice of allegations, which I wrote in January 2016, and then the false narrative, as Houston Nutt's lawyers called it, coming out thereafter. So, yes, there could be, I would think, some jeopardy in that area. The NCAA is not going to comment on it, so we can't get them to say definitively yes or no. This could open them up to additional possible sanctions, but it would stand to reason that an admission of an apology or that they were involved in this activity could carry some other ramifications.
And on that front, Pat, it seems like months ago we were talking about late summer college football season. Maybe we would know where all this stood with the NCAA. Well, we've pretty much reached that point. I haven't heard anything today. Still got a few hours to go. I mean, where are we with a committee hearing being posted?
Yeah, I mean, seemingly it should be within a couple of months here, because we know that the NCAA has responded to Ole Miss's response to the notice of allegations. So, that should start the clock forward towards setting a date. They may not publicize what the date will be, but, if that came out in late July, if they got that response, generally speaking, 6 to 8 weeks after that, so you could be looking mid to late September for a committee hearing, and then after that a ruling another 6 to 8 weeks after that. So it will be the timing of it could be, key for Ole Miss to find out their sanctions if they can before they head into a hiring situation potentially to replace interim Matt Luke and go out and get a new head coach. Because certainly any coach that wants that job is going to want to know where things stand with the NCAA before then.
Pat, finally, and I know I've asked you this, but I'll keep asking until I'm not expecting you to give me a definitive answer, but you know more than I do. Everyone thought Ole Miss needed to get rid of Hugh Freeze to help them with the NCAA Committee on Infractions. Well, they didn't get rid of him for that. We all heard the explanation by Ross Bjork. Now that he's out of the way, what changes other than the fact that Hugh Freeze isn't the head football coach at Ole Miss?
I don't think much does. I'm not sure how it helps Ole Miss's case. Some people have argued that it does because they don't have a guy who's been charged with numerous violations on their staff anymore. But as you said, they sure didn't get rid of him for the alleged violations. They stuck behind him. They quite doggedly defended him in their response to the NCAA. So I think they're still on the hook for that stance, and I haven't seen anything to indicate they're going to change that. The other dynamic, Paul, is Hugh Freeze will be in the room, but he won't be in the room as an Ole Miss employee. Does he have any anger, bitter feelings towards the school? Does he, quote unquote, turn on the school? Does the school turn on him in any way in front of the committee? We won't know because we won't be in the room, but that's another potential wrinkle to all of this that could really change the dynamic.
Great stuff as always. Pat Forty from Yahoo. Many thanks, Pat. Really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Put a little cherry on the top.
Brent Zerneman covers the Texas A&M Aggies for the Houston Chronicle. It's been a long time since we've had a chance to talk to Brent. Brent, good afternoon. And, man, last time we talked to you, Kevin Sumlin was on fire. Today he may be getting fired. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Paul. I was going to say, in the last time you talked to the athletic director from Texas A&M, it's in all of us scrambling. So I perked up when you said you were about to talk to an AD again. Glad it's Missouri and not Scott Woodward.
Scott has not returned our call since we saw him on the beach.
Oh, we have something in common then.
Yeah. Well, let's I say that jokingly. We have not called him because there's nothing more I think he can say. But let's start there. He said what he did in late May. People are still talking about that statement. Has much been said about, not that it matters, but has much been said or anything been said about Kevin Sumlin's status since that moment?
Not really. And, you said you were joking. Well, I wasn't joking. He's gone tight-lipped since then. I think he said what he wanted to say at that point and then said, okay, we're gonna leave it there. And the sense I get from Kevin Sumlin since that time, and really in the past, really since January, is that I don't know that I've ever seen him this laser-focused in on the task at hand. I'll put it that way. And, both on the recruiting trail and going about his business of spring drills and now camp as well. So it might have sparked a fire on that front. I'll put it that way because Kevin Sumlin really, really seems zeroed in at this point.
And let's talk about one of those subjects that he is going to be zeroed in on, and that is the quarterback situation. What's going to happen?
It's looking like it's going to be Nick Starkel, but if you had asked me this, 5 years ago at this time, I would have told you Jamil Showers over Johnny Manziel. So been wrong before. And but Starkel looks like he's out in front of those other guys, maybe even by a good margin. You know what you're getting with Jake Hubenak. Now, if you trotted him out there against UCLA on a Sunday night on September 3rd on national TV, he's taken a college snap. He's been there before. He started the bowl game for the Aggies against Louisville. So he's been out there. So Nick Starkel, never taken a snap. Kellen Mond, never taken a snap. The thing about Starkel, he's been in the program now for a year and a half, and just watching him in practice, I mean, he throws a really pretty pass. I like his mental makeup. He's kind of a character. He's got a good sense of humor, but he knows when to get squared away as well. So right now it's looking like it's going to be Starkel, but that could change in a few weeks as well. But I wouldn't think so.
Let's get a little backstory on him. You started you talked about how long he's been around. What do we know about him?
Yeah, he was a guy who I believe he was an Oklahoma State pledge, and then when Kyler Murray and Kyle Allen transferred, then he got on the Aggies' radar and vice versa, and an Elite 11 guy and tall, rangy, who came to A&M really skinny and has filled out in that time since, and has been in this program now for a while, and he was an early enrollee, so it's not like even though he's listed as a freshman, it's almost like he's a veteran in the program. So a guy you would probably say was underrated out of high school. I know that Oklahoma State really wanted him, and he ended up at A&M when those two guys left with the idea that he would be now getting this opportunity.
Talking to Brent Zerneman, Brent, let's look ahead. Let's look at the season, because this is a really critical year for someone. Everyone knows that. Begins where it began last year, at least against the same team, UCLA, but a much different location. It was a narrow overtime call last year. Let's talk about the schedule beginning at UCLA, then the Arkansas game 4 weeks later or 3 weeks later in Jerry's World, South Carolina, Alabama. Not a terrible schedule, well, unless you consider Alabama an easy game. And then the second part at Florida, Mississippi State, Auburn, New Mexico, at Ole Miss, and at LSU. You can argue it's not a bad schedule, and then you can argue that watch out if things don't get off to a good start.
Right. My argument would be it's maybe even a little tougher than what it's been in the past. I mean, you're always playing the SEC West schedule, of course, but then, as you pointed out, you open at UCLA this year. Well, it took overtime with Myles Garrett at Kyle Field for the Aggies to beat UCLA last season. So then you say, okay, that's shaping up as a tough one with some of the talent. Well, both teams have lost plenty of talent, but the Aggies, obviously on defense as well. And then the one you say, okay, their SEC East opponent this year outside of South Carolina is at Florida. So, in years past, they had Tennessee here last year. They've been at Vanderbilt. So that's their toughest SEC East opponent to date, I would say, being at Florida in mid-October. So in that sense, in addition to playing the SEC West schedule, you have those two games as well. So that's why I would say it shapes up as a little tougher than maybe even last year.
Brent, what we've seen the projections by the media. I mean, what do you hear just talking to the rank and file fans? I mean, what do they expect? And then there's obviously a question after that.
In terms of what do they expect from a record?
One loss record, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm the feel I get and what I'm predicted right now, I'm coming up with 7 wins, and then say, okay, you get to 8 wins again, maybe with the bowl game, but 7-5. And I know that, a lot of my friends here, I live in Bryan College Station, and a lot of them are season ticket holders. Some have backed out of their pledges. There was a group of 16 at one point that is now down to about 6 or 8. My buddy was telling me the other day, just from the idea of saying, until they get it going, until they're competing for SEC West titles, they're not coming back. So there's definitely that kind of sense of they charge so much for tickets, they spend $500 million on Kyle Field, they're not competing for titles. But then Kevin Sumlin is putting together a heck of a recruiting class this year. I think it might shape up as his best yet. And that goes back to what I was talking about with that laser focus and kind of a renewed sense of urgency. So then I think fans are also looking at that and saying, okay, if they get to 8 wins this year, then maybe he does deserve another chance at that point. I think it's a real interesting way. Obviously they can't have the November swoon again, and that's going to be a big part of it. I asked Kevin Sumlin, how do you not screw up your starts, because he's had strong starts when you're trying to remedy the back end of the schedule, and he said that's kind of a tricky proposition. That's part of it.
Brent, how critical is that first game? And I ask it because it's even though it's a Sunday night, it will resonate and reverberate and be digested for weeks, if not longer, especially until the next major game. How big a game is it on the road?
It's huge based on everything we've talked about. And, and UCLA coming here into College Station last year and pushing it to overtime. And, of course, they're going to have to match up with Josh Rosen. And A&M's defense has taken some big hits, losing Myles Garrett, Deshaun Hall at end, to the NFL. And a lot of question marks on that side of the ball. So huge because, as you pointed out, then you have Nicholls State, Louisiana Lafayette at home after that, Arkansas after that to open up SEC play. So, yeah, there will be a few weeks there to digest and dissect what happened in Pasadena that day. So I would say it's really, really big for Kevin Sumlin's future is what it comes down to.
And Brent, listen, you're a good reporter. You're not one just trying to make headlines. You said 7-5. You've obviously given it a lot of thought. I'll let you answer. The 5 losses would be?
Let me look at that real quick. I'd say Florida, Alabama. Neither one of these teams has proven when they play Auburn that they can win on at home. So I'm going to go ahead and say Auburn until they show me otherwise. LSU and then UCLA. Is that 5?
Yeah, that's 5.
I was never very good at math, but there you go.
That would include a win over Arkansas. So,
it would, because based on what I said against playing Auburn, until Brett Bielema in Arkansas shows they can beat Kevin Sumlin, I'm not going to believe it till I see it.
So you mentioned a bowl game, and I'm not trying to answer for anyone other than myself, but I have a hard time believing, Brent, this is just an opinion here, that if Kevin Sumlin ends the regular season with a loss to LSU at 7-5, that he's going to be part of a bowl trip.
I don't know. I think it's how you get. Now, I would have said the same thing a month ago, and it does just it seems like things are still like, okay, let's see where this goes. Let's look at this recruiting class. And I know you can't judge a coach's future on a recruiting class and so forth, but it does seem like there's kind of a wait-and-see approach to see how they get maybe to those 7 or 8 wins. And if he gets to 9 wins, I think he's safe. I don't think there's any doubt about it. So, yeah, you would think probably at 7-5 he wouldn't be coaching in a bowl game. But I've certainly seen stranger things around here as well.
Well done, Brent. Many thanks. Good to have you on.
Okay. You bet, Paul.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast. You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
You're not worth a flail.
Fascinating article today in USA Today about the culture of the South and how it relates to college football. And we thought we would, we're delighted, I should say, to welcome someone who was quoted quite extensively in that piece, the piece entitled College Football's Grip on the South Grows Even Stronger. Dr. Charles Wilson taught at Ole Miss beginning in 1981 until just recently. He is still considered one of the most learned people in this country about Southern culture, having written books about it and also editing is the editor of the New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture. Dr. Wilson, thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to say hello to you, and I'm just regretful that I was never in one of your classes. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, I'm glad to be on. I'm a fan of the show, and glad to be talking with you.
There's so much to talk about on the Ole Miss campus, but we'll leave that for later on another show. But I am curious, though, because having been there recently, having been being such a fan of that community in terms of the richness and not only the past, but in literature, with, of course, William Faulkner's home being there, something that you've obviously studied and written about. Give us, before we get too deep into the world of college football, just your a little bit on what led you to this field and just how it intersects with society every day in this part of the country.
Well, I grew up in partly in Middle Tennessee. My parents on both sides were from little towns north of Nashville, tobacco-growing country. And so I identified with Tennessee football like my dad did for a while, but then I moved to West Texas and really grew up in El Paso, but came back every summer with grandparents. And when I went to graduate school at the University of Texas, I realized that the South, Southern culture was a fascinating thing to study. I mean, I'm a historian, so I was looking for a great subject, but it was also a personal interest to me. And so it became my career to try to decipher what made the South what it was, what it has been, and how it's changed. Also, I've always been interested in that issue of the sort of continuities and changes in the contemporary South.
And, of course, one of your books, I want to make sure I don't misquote the name. It's a rather lengthy subject. It's a study of post-Civil War South. Judgment and Grace in Dixie, Southern Faith from Faulkner to Elvis. couple of I don't want to call Faulkner a Mississippi boy. That would not really be justice, but certainly Elvis grew up in Tupelo. I'm just so intrigued by that, and especially the post-Civil War, which I know you've written about, and certainly a learned scholar in, how it moves forward to the 20th century, and ultimately how it affected all of us with our love of college football.
Well, there's been this long belief that people who've thought about the South advance, that there's some special destiny or mission related to the South. And, of course, the Civil War was an expression of that people believed they should go to war to defend their society. But losing that war left an indelible mark on the South, having to come to, how do you come to terms with defeat in a war like that? And so that always has hung over the South, that sense of defeat. And what happened after the Civil War is a tremendous poverty that settled in because of the economic crisis after the war, the lack of industrialization. The South pretty much put all of its eggs in the basket of agrarianism and farming, and it was prosperous for some people, but not for a lot of people. It's a very hard scrabble past that a lot of our Southern people had, but they developed culture, I think, as a kind of compensation for that. And the great writers emerged. I asked Eudora Welty one time why there were so many great writers in the older South. She said, "Honey, there wasn't anything else to do." But writing, the writers pull from the great storytelling tradition of the South that developed in the small towns after the Civil War and in the early 20th century. Our musicians, of course, emerged with that also gift of word and rhythm, and became the great figures in American musical history. And religion, of course, was the great compensation as well, with a deep religious tradition that developed in the South. Well, sports became part of that. Of course, a long tradition of recreation, of hunting and fishing in the South, but in the mid-20th century, spectator sports emerged, and Southerners really took to those. And it had special meaning in the South because it was a way to victory in a region that had still lived with us generations of memory of defeat. And the iconic figure, of course, was Bear Bryant at Alabama. And he was a figure that symbolized the transformation of the South. He grew up on a sharecropping farm in hardscrabble, Arkansas, but he became a symbol of the transformation of the South into the kind of middle-class South that we now have, a place of suburbs and tailgating and football. And college football came to mean have special meaning. The Ohio State-Michigan game is an important one, but Ohio has the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals, and Michigan has the Detroit professional teams. There aren't professional teams in the South, so we invest a huge amount in our college football programs, I think. And so Alabama and Auburn becomes the titanic struggle for sports fans and other rivalries across the region.
And it's so interesting because I've dealt with it not from perhaps a level of your scholar, but maybe from more on the ground level. But they're just I often hear, Dr. Wilson, I'm curious what you think. I still hear the Civil War being fought out daily on this program when someone walks in here from the north with a take on college football.
Well, there's still that sectionalism that survives despite all of our changes and all the connections between the North and the South and the West and all of this. There's still often a sense among Southerners that they're not treated well in the national culture and the popular culture. Often stereotypes survive. And we have stereotypes ourselves with people in other parts of the country. So that's a deeply rooted kind of cultural trait that even though we travel and meet people from other parts of the country and appreciate them one-on-one, we still harbor these stereotypes often. And, of course, the college football is such an emotionally intense experience, and it involves these great teams from all across the country. And, again, I go back to Bear Bryant. When Alabama played Notre Dame, for example. It was a meeting of titans in those days, and all of that regional history and all of that went into those games, and so that was one of the reasons that Bryant became so legendary, is that he won those battles. He won those battles. He proved the South could win, and of course that still survives. Of course, we still have rivalries within our states that reflect a kind of intrastate sectionalism as well. And you're quite familiar with Ole Miss and Mississippi State. I hear that on your program all the time. But all across the South, you have these regional rivalries within the country, within the states, and so it's somehow part of human nature, I guess.
Dr. Wilson, I have to ask, because we've spent some lazy summer days casting movies about Southern football coaches, but you had this line in the USA Today article about comparing today's college football coaches, especially in the South, with some of the old great Confederate generals who continue to be glamorized today, even though I don't want to say this too loudly, the South did lose the war. I mean, not to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you've given this some thought over the years, whether it's Bryant or Johnny Vaught from yesteryear or General Saban of today. I mean, are there any points of reference that you could lead us to?
Well, I think that in the late 19th century, the Confederate generals had this incredible mystique. Even though, as we know, they lost, they came to symbolize a kind of character and old-fashioned virtue that people admired. And I think the college coaches today, the really successful ones, have some of that same mystique. They symbolize success on the national stage, and they're kind of they reflect, though, the contemporary South. The late 19th century was a very different time, and that nurtured that Confederate memory. But the contemporary South is a place of business orientation, business success. We admire business people as kind of new icons of our culture. The old agrarian South simply isn't anymore. Bear Bryant would not fit well in today as a kind of cultural symbol the way he did at his time, moving from that older South into the newer South. Now, we admire CEOs and business executives that can bring jobs and symbolize that fact that the South can compete now not only nationally but on a global scale as well. The generals lost, but the coaches win, and that's why they're so successful, I think, and so such central figures in our culture today.
And I'm sure people who read the article you knew differently discovered today something that maybe they didn't know or have never thought about, that one of William Faulkner's iconic books, Light in August, had very little to do with the opening of college football season.
It's true, but Faulkner actually wrote about football. In one of his novels, The Hamlet, he has this character, LeBeau, who comes... He's kind of like Bear Bryant, really. He's a fictional version of Bear Bryant, written 30 years before Bryant came on the scene. But this character, LeBeau, was off of a sharecropper farm in rural Mississippi. But the Ole Miss coach, again a fictional coach, offers him food and shelter if he'll play football on Saturday afternoon, and he does, and he loves it, and he finds this spirit within him. That is released on the football field every Saturday afternoon when he carries the football. And it's a wonderful kind of deep literary portrayal of this football player.
I have to ask you quickly. I interviewed John Grisham recently, certainly a proud graduate, both Mississippi State, and he's a big sports fan. But I missed the Faulkner era in Oxford. Was he a fan?
He was not a fan, and of course you got to remember the football stadium is Hemingway Stadium. Ernest Hemingway, of course, but he was not who the field was named for, but he was the other great rival to Faulkner, is the great 20th century writer. But Faulkner was a great golfer. He loved golfing, of all things, but he was not a particular football fan, as far as I know.
So regrettable. I just would have. It would have been so much fun to talk about the games coming up on Saturday. Dr. Wilson, thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time, and hopefully we will be able to revisit this subject. It's not going away. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Oh, wow. How cool. Dr. Charles Wilson.
Thank you for listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast. The Paul Finebaum Show airs weekdays on the SEC Network, beginning at 3 Eastern.